dear ladies and gentlemen. The lights are in my eyes, so I don't see all the graduates, but I know that you are quite a number here today, and it's wonderful to see you. This is the culmination of your time here in Malmo, and I'm sure that you will use the knowledge acquired here well, not only for your own benefit, but for the benefit of society. I'm afraid we live in a time when egoism and what's in it for me tends to dominate to quite some extent. We also live in a time when debates are becoming more and more polarized, and it's increasingly difficult to reach balance and compromise in political discussions. Things are portrayed either as white or black, but that's no way to run a family, a business, and in particular not a society. If we are to successfully address all the challenges we are confronted with, we need to focus more on the common good and on working together. And this, in my view, is one of the most important takeaways now that you leave Malmö and go back to your home countries. Let me use this address to focus in particular on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. The year 2015 was sort of a landmark year when it comes to international cooperation. We had both the Agenda 2030, the so-called SDGs, and the Paris Agreement. And I can tell you, a year later, it would not have been possible with Donald Trump in the White House. While I applaud both achievements, we have to be clear about the challenges, not least in terms of implementation. As you know, there is a saying, the devil is in the details. I would say here, the devil is in the implementation. And one of the reasons is, of course, that today mankind is in danger of what I would call systemic collapse on many fronts, including threats to the very philosophical underpinnings of modern society in the form of democracy, respect for human rights, the rule of law, the importance of science and enlightened leadership. We see ultra-right and nationalistic politicians gaining ground in a growing number of countries. And they are making it increasingly difficult to agree on the necessary policy frameworks in a globalized economy. Like Isabella Lövin said at the reception last night, in today's world we need more cooperation, not less cooperation. But this is only one of the many challenges we face. Decades of exponential growth in both population and consumption is now hitting the limits of the Earth's biosphere. The climate is destabilizing. Half of the topsoil on planet Earth have been depleted in the last 100 years. Nearly 90% of fish stocks are either overfished or fully fished. And the 6th mass extinction event is well underway because of us humans. I did a calculation for my most recent book together with Ernst von Weizsäcker. We looked at the body weight of land-based vertebrates. Wild animals have gone down to 3%, the rest being humans and our domesticated animals. 100 years ago, it would have been totally different. But that's just one measure how we are marginalizing biodiversity and other species. And this truly cannot go on. Our neoclassical economic model that has served us well was designed in what I would call an empty world, with a population around 2 billion people, where the bounty of natural resources seemed endless. Today we live in a full world, with soon to be 8 billion people. And I can tell you, we need other economic thinking to deal with that. Conventional economic growth we have seen on and on again is no longer sustainable, despite desperate efforts to keep it afloat. And there is an urgent need for not only new economic thinking, but new indicators that value quality and not only quantity. A few weeks ago, we had a stark warning from the IPCC 1.5 degree report, underlining the existential threat to mankind posed by climate change. Earlier this week, the WWF International launched a report telling us that 60% of animal vertebrates have been wiped out since 1970. Yesterday morning, and very relevant for this occasion, we had yet another piece of troubling news, this time coming from the meeting of the Antarctic Ocean Commission. A plan to turn a huge tract of pristine Antarctic Ocean into the world's biggest sanctuary has been rejected, throwing the future of one of the Earth's most important ecosystems into doubt. If we look at the SDGs more in detail, there was a declaration accompanying the treaty with a vision statement that includes the following. We, the signatories, envisage a world in which development and the application of technology are climate sensitive, respect biodiversity, and are resilient. While I strongly support this vision, there remains a need to examine the consistency of the SDGs and the modalities under which the goals will be implemented. What is really the meaning of the quoted statement? It surely relates to the 3 environmental SDGs, speaking in firm language about the urgent action needed to combat climate change, the importance of conserving and sustainably using the oceans, and about protecting, restoring, and promoting sustainable use of land-based ecosystems. That is to say, Goal 13, 14, and 15. Nowhere, however, is it admitted in the 2030 agenda that the success in reaching the 11 social and economic goals, goals 1 to 11, if done based on conventional growth policies, would make it very difficult to reduce the speed of global warming, to stop the overfishing and the pollution of the oceans, and to stop land degradation. In other words, assuming no major changes in the way the economies are organized and the way economic growth is defined and pursued, humanity would be confronted with massive trade-offs between the socio-economic and the environment SDGs. And in my opinion, conventional growth policies are at the core today of the ecosystem decline, biodiversity loss, and a rapidly changing climate. I know there are still a lot of politicians who claim that conventional growth is the only way forward. I beg to differ. Conventional growth may very well lift more people out of poverty, at least for now, but it will make it increasingly difficult to come to grips with the threats against Goal 13, 14, and 15. But let me be very clear on one thing, and this is an important message to the graduates. It is not growth and development per se that is the challenge. Rather, the pursuit of conventional growth measured in GDP and a growing footprint all the time. GDP is a quantitative indicator. It was never meant to be a welfare indicator. It measures the amount of production, but it says nothing about the quality. Coal-powered electricity plants are equal to solar-powered electricity plants. And yet, we know there is a great difference. Let me now turn more specifically to climate change. The most recent report from the IPCC is crystal clear. One of the objectives of that report was to try to distinguish between moving to 1.5 degree warming or 2 degree warming. And the report emphasizes many differences in terms of impact, such as hot temperature extremes, heavy precipitation events, extreme droughts, sea level rise, species loss, and coral reef destruction. And the report sends a very stark reminder to the world community about the existential threat posed by climate change. Society has to undergo major transformation in order to meet the goals. And that transformation, my friends, has hardly begun. We see some transformation in terms of electric power generation, but in the rest of society, very little. What we have done in Europe over the last 15 to 20 years, and I've been intimately involved in that climate policy making, is what I would call incremental steps. We have been cutting away a few percentages of emissions here and there. By doing so, we will cut emissions by roughly 20% until 2020. However, if we were to include consumption and the huge imports of embedded carbon from other parts of the world, and if we were to include aviation and shipping, we have not cut emissions at all. Another task, according to the IPCC, is to move towards zero greenhouse gas emissions in 2050. For that to happen, we need more than incremental steps. We need transformation. And by this I mean the way we build infrastructure, basic materials like cement and steel, transport and mobility, including, of course, aviation and shipping, textiles, electronics, and not least land use, not least agriculture. Every time we put a plow in the soil, we release carbon. But there are other practices developing which could deal with that problem quite efficiently. On the positive side is that there are solutions in most areas. We have seen a lot of technology progress more recently. And digitization of the economy, if we use it well, may help us even further. And there are several independent studies showing that if we do the transformation right, we would benefit greatly also economically in the years to come. But there are barriers to change. One is the short-term nature of the economic system. Most efforts are geared towards profit maximization in the short term, and that is rarely compatible with long-term sustainability. Another is, of course, the failure of market prices to reflect all the costs of production. Pollution costs are imposed on society at large. A third one is the strong resistance among all the businesses that depend on fossil fuels. And of course, a lot of countries that depend on the extraction of fossil fuels. And yet another, and this is very important for many of you graduates who come from low-income countries, that there is still a lacking of financial support for low-income countries to invest in the low-carbon economy. If we were to take the IPCC report more seriously, I believe we should agree on an emergency plan. Most governments don't talk that language yet, but an increasing number of scientists and civil society organizations do that. Last week we had the 50th anniversary of the Club of Rome in Rome, and we adopted a climate emergency plan. And the overarching umbrella is to adopt what we call a global carbon law, referring to Moore's law in the digital community, and basically saying, cut the emissions by half every decade until 2050. Then we could reach the Paris goals. And to do that, we would need a number of very distinct actions in different parts of the economy. Halt fossil fuel expansion and fossil fuel subsidies by 2020. Triple annual investments in renewable energy, in particular in developing countries. Introduce realistic pricing and taxation to reflect the true cost of fossil fuel use and embedded carbon. Replace GDP growth, I already alluded to that, with other indicators. Ensure greater materials efficiency, and this is important. Cement, steel, plastic, aluminium make up roughly 20% of carbon emissions. And the increase in infrastructure, in particular in developing countries, is very, very fast. So unless we do innovation there or substitution, we will have a problem. Another area which is directly and indirectly very much coupled to carbon emissions is textiles. 6 to 7% of carbon emissions come from textiles. And the business models there in modern fashion are far from sustainable. Cheap clothing being bought and thrown away after a few months and then buy new one. All these sectors have to be rethought. And finally, we need to accelerate regenerative land use, do agriculture differently. And then finally, of course, make sure that the pledge made by industrialized countries in Paris to support low-income countries with at least 100 billion euros or dollars per year for low-carbon investments, that is really fulfilled. Now, among all the sectors of the economy, two are sticking out: aviation and shipping. And they were also not part of the Paris Agreement. But because of the fact that overall global temperature rise depends on cumulative emissions, the Paris Agreement will require drastic cuts by all sectors, including, of course, the shipping sector. And for this sector to be more proactive, I would see two reasons. One is to be part of the whole and to assume its responsibility, like all other sectors. But the other one is also because of the direct and indirect effects global warming has on the oceans. I read a couple of weeks ago a report by Reuters telling us about some dramatic changes. And I quote, "In the last few decades, the oceans have undergone unprecedented warming. Currents have shifted. These changes are for most part not visible from land, but this hidden climate change has had disturbing impact on marine life. In effect," and this is interesting as an expression, "creating an epic underwater refugee crisis." And Reuters has discovered that from the waters off the east coast of the US to the coast of West Africa, marine creatures are fleeing for their lives, and the communities that depend on them are facing disruption as a result. As waters warm, fish and other sea life are migrating towards the poles, seeking to maintain the even temperatures they need to thrive and breed. To me, this was a shocking reading. And of course, emissions from shipping and from many other sectors is part of the reason for this development. And therefore it must be seen, I think, as primary responsibility for this sector to really do something about emissions. Sea freight emits approximately 1 gigaton, that is about between 2 and 2.5% of total global emissions. And although shipping is the most energy efficient transport mode to move large volumes of cargo, we know that business as usual will lead to continued increase in emissions. And let me remind you that the carbon law that I quoted would ask us all to cut emissions by half to 2030. And for that to happen, this sector must really rise to the occasion. In 2018, the IMO committed, that was in May this year, to halving greenhouse gases by 2050 compared to the 1998 levels. Although the decision is in the right direction, it still represents a pathway that is much too high. I talked with the Secretary General before the meeting, and we both agree that there are a lot of opportunities to work on. So I hope we can continue that discussions afterwards. I also know that that IMO has done a lot in the recent past to encourage energy efficiency, both for the existing fleet and for new ships. But still, there is a lot to be done. And we see also technological developments that are very positive, but we also know that for part of the fleet, they are often too expensive to invest in. The existing world fleet is in many segments old-fashioned and outdated, and there is an imbalance between supply and demand. That is to say, ship capacity is greater than demand. an inadequate degree of cargo coordination and oversupplying cargo capacity results in downward pressure on freight rates and revenue. And finally, the absolute majority of shipping companies are small and they operate a fleet of only a few ships. So this means that the necessary transformation is more difficult. I've been working with some researchers in Turku, Finland, that have tried to identify some areas where progress could be easily made. One of them is that in many ports there is a lack of a slot system, meaning that first come, first served. The implication is that ships cannot plan for optimal handling in the port. They often speed at sea, meaning higher emissions, and yet may spend a lot of time waiting. By improved communication and information sharing between cargo owners, ship operators and ports, cargo handling could be improved. And estimates tell of emissions reductions of maybe 10%. Another problem is low ship utilization rates. And here again, if we could have more efficient handling of cargo, another 23 to 30% of emissions reduction. Time spent in ports, I already alluded to that. If time would be shorter, we would need a higher degree of automation. This would require capital investments that maybe the current owner structure of many small ports seem unable to make. There is also a lack of incentives for offering environmentally friendly freights. On land, as you know, green cargo is increasing. In the shipping, it's not. Here, cargo owners could take initiatives, just as is the case for road transport. And finally, there is a lack of investments in better technology. There are better technologies available that can reduce emissions significantly, such as sleeker hull design, lighter materials, biofuels and methanol, and new propulsion technologies like batteries and fuel cells. Retrofitting, however, is expensive, and the existing fleet is renewed slowly. Existing overcapacity is yet another barrier. From this very brief description of the challenges facing shipping in relation to climate change, I hope it is obvious both about the need to drastically reduce emissions, but as well that there are ample opportunities to move the agenda forward. Dear graduates, I have shared with you some of the challenges facing mankind in the years to come. None of them are easy, and the political environment of today is far from conducive to change. Yet pessimism is no option. We need to focus on the challenges and believe in the opportunities to bring about change. We have the knowledge, we have the technologies. It is very often the will that is lacking. The shipping sector is crucial to success. We have to protect the oceans from all kinds of pollution, and the shipping sector has to be part of that solution. Each and every one of you graduating here today is likely to be in a position in the future where you can influence developments in the shipping sector. You know what has to be done. You have to do your utmost to be part of the solution, whether as senior officials in ministries or as managers in cargo handling, in ports, or in shipping companies. I'm absolutely sure that the WMU network of alumni will be there to help you. The same goes, I believe, for the recently established Ocean Institute. By the way, a very good initiative. All of us here wish you all possible luck in your future endeavors. You will be in the forefront of the battle to save our oceans.
Let's give again a big hand of applause to Dr. Wichmann.